Okay, so let's start with Dr. Bavon. Could you introduce yourself?
Okay, yeah, my name is Al Bavon, and I'm a professor of public administration at the Clinton School of Public Service.
Thank you. Dr. Graybill.
All right, I'm Leslie Graybill. I'm the Director of Service Learning and Volunteerism at the University of Central Arkansas.
Thank you. And Dr. Hoffman.
Hi, I'm Kim Hoffman. I'm a professor of public administration in the Department of Political Science at UCA.
Thank you. And my name is Malcolm North. I'm with the PhD Leadership Studies program as assistant professor and chair of this astounding work from Sharon. So I'm going to hand you the floor now, Sharon. You can tell us a little bit about yourself and get ready for your presentation.
All right, well, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. All right, can everybody see my screen? Okay, great. Well, as Dr. North said, my name is Sharon Lanier, and I am here to share with you my research on the design and validation of the Public Value Collaboration Assessment, or PVCA, as I have lovingly come to call this instrument. It's measuring the public value created through cross-sector collaboration. And before I do anything further, I have to first give a huge, huge thank you to my committee. To my committee chair, Dr. North. There's no way I'm sitting here today if it had not been for all of your guidance through this process. You helped this lady who was terrified of statistics initially learn how to use those statistics to develop an entire instrument. And so I am forever in your debt. To Dr. Bavon and Dr. Graybill and Dr. Hoffman, thank you so much for your gifts of time in helping me edit my document. I can only imagine your lives are busy, you have lots of priorities, but you took the time to help me achieve this goal, and I greatly, greatly appreciate you for that. All right, so here's a look at where we're headed today. We'll start out with looking at just a little background, kind of why this research is important. I'll give you a little history of why I chose this topic in the first place, and the purpose of this study. Then we'll move into what we already know, the literature review, and I won't spend a ton of time in that area because my committee is familiar with my theoretical foundations already. So I will touch on them for those that are here that may not be familiar with the frameworks and the literature that goes into how we develop this instrument. Then we'll go into how we develop the instrument. We'll look at the methodology that I use, the data collection and statistical analysis. And then finally, we'll talk about what it means, what these findings actually can help us do, and how this instrument can be used in practice and for future research. I'd like to first share what led me to this moment. I began my nonprofit career working for a veteran support organization, which it's interesting, tomorrow is Veterans Day. And so ever since having that experience of working for a veteran support organization, it rings differently for me because I understand these heroes from a different perspective now after having that time. But I transitioned out of corporate America and into the nonprofit world, and I immediately fell in love with mission-focused work. And in the introduction of my dissertation, I opened with a story about a group of community leaders that consisted of a nonprofit executive from a veteran support organization, a workforce agency director from a government agency, a veterans mental health specialist, and a homelessness and shelter and housing specialist, and an education and training representative. That was actually based on a true story of a collaboration that had already taken place when I joined the nonprofit organization. It was actually kind of towards the tail end of that partnership. And what I realized right away was how much structure it lacked. The partners came, there was always arguments about how and what should be tracked and measured. It really lacked structure and progress tracking. They each brought with them their own conceptualizations about what they should be doing. And sadly, that partnership did end up dissolving. And those veterans who were receiving services ended up losing the benefit of that program. And that's actually what prompted me to come to the LEAD program at UCA, was because I wanted to understand collaborative leadership, especially from a community collaboration perspective. Now, I work for a foundation where we make grants to nonprofit organizations, and I see this over and over and over again with the nonprofits that we serve. They struggle. They collaborate with other sectors, but they struggle to figure out how to really measure their impact, how to share that story with the community. And so that's what prompted my desire to want to develop this instrument, because these organizations are engaged in really complex collaborations dealing with issues like poverty and substance abuse, and they lack the ability to really track their collective impact. And so I saw that as just a basic need for an instrument that could help with that. And so this brings me to the problem that we're going to be looking at. The problem is just that there was a lack of a scale that could help measure public value created through cross-sector collaboration. And so the purpose of this study was to develop such an instrument. The research questions that I focused on looked mainly at first, what items needed to be on the instrument. That was the most important aspect of the central focus initially, was what were those items that needed to be on the instrument. And then after that, I wanted to really use that, after the scale was developed, I wanted to really use that to understand collaborators more deeply and to find out if the instrument could be used to make predictions about collaboration outcomes. And so we'll start by first looking at the cross-sector collaboration framework. My very first semester at UCA, Dr. McClellan introduced this framework, and it was, for me, was like an aha moment, like a light went off, because this was exactly what I had experienced in the nonprofit sector. It's defined as a linking or sharing of information, resources, activities, and capabilities by organizations in two or more sectors to jointly achieve an outcome that cannot be achieved by organizations in one sector separately. And this is what I saw over and over with nonprofit work, was that you would often partner with a government agency or with an education provider, or in some cases another nonprofit, to solve these really difficult social issues. And you bring together stakeholders from, all different backgrounds, all different perspectives. And it was really wonderful to bring these people together, but with collaboration often comes conflict, because again, people bring different conceptualizations about what is important and what the community needs. And so the next phase that I looked at was through following the line of inquiry was public value. Because the litmus test of any collaboration is how much public value does it produce? Mark Moore's groundbreaking research established public value analysis as a distinct area in 1995. And historically, this research has emphasized public value focused largely on public administrators and them serving as leaders that are juggling performance and mandates and political initiatives and the distribution of public benefits to people. But now we know that public value can be created by anyone, not just public administrators, but by anyone working in the public sphere for social benefit. This research uses a definition that incorporates cross-sector collaboration at the heart of public value creation. And that definition is public value is the extent to which cross-sector collaboration achieves its overarching and subsidiary purposes, meets applicable mandates, achieves lasting and widespread benefits at a reasonable cost that no single organization could achieve alone in a democratically responsible and accountable way. This framework features three main components: democratic accountability, procedural legitimacy, and substantive outcomes. These were the indicators some of the indicators that I incorporated into developing the items for the instrument that we'll later discuss. All in all, after an in-depth literature review, the 5 dimensions that I hypothesized based on what the literature said, and also based on a practical understanding of cross-sector collaboration and public value, the 5 dimensions were focused on democratic accountability, which highlights the importance of focusing on accountability in funding and in partner dynamics, and accountability to the communities they served. It's concerned with facilitating conversation and learning and broad consensus on critical topics across stakeholders. Also, procedural legitimacy. These are partnerships that are transparent and offer open decision-making processes, and that they're responsible to authorizers and the citizens. They are legal, and they are viewed by the public as being legitimate. The next thing that was really important was social impact from the beneficiary perspective. This was something that I saw lacking throughout the literature. When we talked about public value, it was really so much focused on processes and procedures, and not the people who should be at the heart of creating public value. And so incorporating beneficiary perspective into the instrument is concerned with both the short and the long-term impact of the collaboration's efforts from the perspective of those served. It's evaluating social change efforts directly from the mouths of those who are in the midst of them, trying to understand what they say and feel they can truly do and be. And many social impact measurement instruments that exist today focus on it largely in terms of benefits, from a cost benefit perspective. And so they translate it into monetary benefits, but it really is not effective in understanding the long-term goals of how something changed someone's life for the better, how it might have impacted their ability to be a better parent so that their children and their children's children have different and better outcomes. The next aspect that is incorporated into this instrument is continuous evaluation. And this is concerned with collectively monitoring ongoing processes, because the thing with public value is that what the public values, what they need and want today, may not be what they need and want tomorrow. So it's important to consistently evaluate your program, your collaborative program, to ensure that you are staying with the time of what's needed and valued. And then lastly, substantive outcomes is keenly concerned with a collaboration that adds public value by achieving its objectives and goals in an accountable and effective way, and also has an understanding of what the need is in order to reach those goals. So those were my 5 dimensions that I initially started with. The next phase was to begin construction of the instrument. And this process was carried out first, of course, with the literature review, and then moving into the scale design. Overall, the methodology for this study consisted of 3 phases. 1 being the planning and construction, 2 being to administer the instrument once it was complete and constructed, and then finally the statistical analysis. So let's talk a little bit about the process. In phase 1, the scale was designed using general theory on item development, which encompasses things like making sure that the wording has a low cognitive load, making sure that each question focuses on one central thought. I used a Likert type scale because that's one that's very common in social sciences to operationalize those values of public value. It was closed-ended questions that asked the respondents the extent to which their organization or the partner organizations engaged in certain behaviors or exhibited certain attitudes related to the specific cross-sector collaboration that they had been engaged in. When the final item pool of items were generated, I had 52 items initially, and I worked with an expert review committee that helped me to whittle that down a little bit to get the content validity. And what that looked like was a panel of subject matter experts. Shout out to Ethan. Ethan served as one of my subject matter experts, people who work in the public sector, in government roles and in nonprofit leadership roles, but who have a very clear understanding of community partnership and public value as a whole. And so this panel of 3, it was 3 altogether, review team helped to validate the content. They were asked to review the items in terms of content, style, and comprehensiveness. And then that information was used to calculate the content validity index at the item level, which was computed by the number of experts rating it from a scale of not relevant all the way to very relevant, and then divided by the total number of experts. That value ranged from 0 to 1, and values greater than 0.75 were indicated that the item was relevant and therefore it was retained. Test items with a score of 0.50 to 0.74 were updated or revised. The wording was revised. And then items with less than 0.50 were eliminated. So this step was really helpful in determining misleading or unclear items. And that helped us take the scale from 52 items to 42 items. And with that, the scale construction was complete and we were ready to administer it. And so the next phase was actually the recruitment, participant recruitment. And the instrument was administered to a sample of nonprofit and public sector organizations selected from publicly accessible national lists of organizations online, as well as multiple social sites that target public practitioners. You can see on the screen some of the different organizations that were used and some of the different tactics that were used. Individuals had to self-identify as having worked in a cross-sector collaborative initiative to be a part of the study. And the instructions in the study were for them to refer specifically to a collaborative initiative in order to answer the questions. Participants were given a short description of the purpose of the research and how it was voluntary, and assurances that their confidentiality would be respected. And then they also gave informed consent. And some demographic information was gathered that allowed for some additional analysis, and we'll talk about that later. Responses were collected until there were a minimum of 4 responses per item. Prior to the data analysis, the data was cleaned and organized. Of the 231 respondents who began the survey, 75 had missing data or unengaged responses that were evidenced by a short completion time or a highly repetitive answer pattern. So I eliminated those from further analysis. So this left us with 156 respondents for further analysis. And next, descriptive statistics were run on the remaining respondents in this study. Most of the respondents were female, and over half of them had more than a decade of experience in their respective field. The majority of those completing the survey were white and held leadership roles within their respective organizations, which many of them reported to be in the nonprofit sector. Additional demographic data that was captured was organization mission, number of partner organizations, and collaboration focus issues. So once the data was ready for analysis, the first step was to conduct an exploratory factor analysis. An EFA is a statistical process that can be used to reduce the items down to the most significant amount of items to ensure they have reliability to measure the construct that we're trying to measure. They help us to define the important content that's there, and also it identifies the items that are performing well or not performing well. It was a bit like putting together a puzzle. You know, you have this idea of what your picture looks like, but you have to figure out what pieces go in to make the pattern come together. And so I had, of course, hypothesized the 5 factors, the 5 dimensions that we reviewed earlier. And within those 5 dimensions, the items reflective of those 5 dimensions were what we were looking at with EFA. And so what EFA helped us do was to figure out whether or not these were in fact the right questions, the right items that should be on this instrument to measure those constructs. Prior to doing the EFA, the items were coded and examined for skewness and kurtosis. The KMO and Bartlett sphericity tests were performed to determine whether factor analysis was even appropriate for this sample, which it was. As you can see by the scores there, KMO statistic can have a value between 0 and 1, with a higher value indicating that factor analysis is appropriate. And so we did have that satisfied. And the Bartlett's test of sphericity, which is used to determine the degree of redundancy between the variables, it also can have a value, it should have a value of less than 0.05, which, as you can see there, the KMO value was 0.907, and the Bartlett's test of sphericity was significant, indicating that both of those conditions were satisfied. The EFA was really important for helping us to determine reliability with our sample. We employed a principal components analysis PCA with 42 items and 156 responses. And in this process, I ran this through multiple times. And this is again, where I said thank you to Dr. North for the many late night text messages, weekend calls of, help me make sure I'm reading this right. He was so helpful. And I greatly appreciate you so much, Dr. North, for that. Because he gave a lot of outside of office hours time to help me with this puzzle of putting together this analysis. But I used the PCA, which basically the intent of PCA, which is again principal components analysis, is to determine the fewest factors that jointly account for the total variance in the correlation matrix of the original variables. I did try a few other methods. As you all know, anybody that's ever used SPSS knows that it has 1,000,001 different ways you can use it. And so I did try other extraction methods, but I found that this sample was generally insensitive to other extraction and rotation methods. So I ended up using a PCA extraction method with a Pro Max rotation. This gave us the best visualization of the data. It also helped me to figure out which of the variables loaded well together and which ones didn't load well together. I excluded cases, during the EFA process, I excluded cases list-wise, and I suppressed small coefficients that were smaller than 0.4. And I also extracted factors based on eigenvalues greater than 1. So when this process would run, I could see which ones loaded together, which ones didn't. Factors that only loaded with one item were eliminated. I also used reduction procedures that looked at when items loaded on more than one factor. I removed those as well. So cross-loaded items, any factor or cross-load that had cross-loadings was also, any items that cross-loaded on multiple factors was eliminated. And so again, I reran that process multiple times and finally got to a pretty solid group of items that made sense, but I also wanted to use a qualitative approach to determine the most meaningful items to retain based on their theoretical underpinnings. So I wanted to look at interpretability to make sure if someone's using this survey, this instrument, do these items make sense together? And then finally, is there a simple structure, which you'll see on the next slide, a simple structure in which they're not cross-loading, they make sense together, they load with items that also have a similar concept, and basically they capture the construct that they're trying to measure. If items were not sufficiently clear, or if they produced inconsistent responses, those were also deleted. And so the final result was a 17-item model. So we went from 52, then we went to 42, ended up with 17 after the EFA process. 17-item model with 4 factors. So this slide displays the final pattern matrix and item loadings on each factor. And while the final solution did not map out to the 5 separate dimensions that I initially predicted, they do include items from each of those dimensions. And it's noteworthy that the items, whereas I thought that legitimacy, procedural legitimacy and democratic accountability would be separate factors, they actually loaded together on one factor. So that's why we have 4 factors instead of 5. But they have items from both procedural legitimacy and democratic accountability loading together. The first factor I named evaluation because the items that loaded together refer to various aspects of the evaluation process. Here on the slide, you can see the item wording, the item number, and the item wording for each of these factors. The second factor I named responsibility, as those items were, again, this is what I was mentioning about the two dimensions kind of collapsing into one. So instead of calling it either procedural legitimacy or democratic accountability, I just renamed that factor to responsibility because essentially at the heart of that construct is responsible practices that refer to accountability and legitimacy of the collaboration. The third factor I named community with a focus on understanding social impact from the beneficiary perspective and involving community stakeholders. And then the final factor is outcomes because these items are directly or indirectly related to the collaboration's production of outcomes based on an understanding of the need and spreading those outcome benefits out equitably. So with the instrument development process, so the holy grail is making sure you can get reliability and validity. And so the first step in that is to confirm that the instrument is reliable, which refers to the extent to which those results can be reproduced when research is repeated under the same conditions, and that it accurately measures the desired construct. It can be assessed by examining the internal reliability, the construct reliability, and the average variance extracted. Internal reliability is obtained when the Cronbach's alpha value is greater than 0.70. And so to determine that internal reliability, I first looked at the scale's overall Cronbach's alpha, which had a high reliability of 0.908. And then I also looked at the individual factors within the scale and found that each of them also had good Cronbach's alpha values, with evaluation being 0.879, responsibility being 0.808, community being 0.749, and outcomes being 0.770. Construct reliability was also assessed to measure the factor's internal consistency with values greater than 0.70, indicating good reliability. And we'll talk about construct reliability and average variance extracted. Those values were also satisfactory. We'll talk about them on the next slide. So here we've done the first initial steps of reliability in our EFA analysis, and we did find good reliability with this set of question items. Next, I wanted to look at the validity of the instrument. Validity refers to the instrument's capacity to measure the construct it is intended to measure. And the two types of validity that are required for the measurement model are convergent validity and discriminant validity. Convergent validity is the degree to which the items of a constructs theoretically are related. And discriminant validity measures whether the concepts that are not supposed to be related are actually unrelated. This helps us to identify redundancy, because essentially you don't want two factors that measure the same thing. That's redundant. So that's what those two validity measures look at. To obtain the convergent validity, the value of the AVE, which is the average variance extracted, should be greater than 0.50 for each factor. And as we see, our AVE requirement was satisfied. Validity is also assessed by calculating the maximum shared variance, that's the MSV, and the average shared variance. When the AVE is greater than the MSV or the ASV, then you can claim discriminant validity is obtained. And as we can see, that measure is also satisfied with our resulting values. AVE should be equal or greater than 0.50. And as we can see from our AVE here, which was the first one that I highlighted, that is met, that was met. And it should also be less than the construct validity, which if you look at the numbers there, we see that they are in fact less than the construct validity. So for the final model, it shows that the construct reliability, getting tongue-tied. For the final model, we show that the construct reliability indices indicate good reliability for all factors. All of them were above 0.70. In addition, the indices of convergent validity indicated no validity concerns. All four factors AVE were less than the construct reliability and greater than 0.50. Finally, the indices of discriminant validity indicate good validity for all four factors, all the AVE markedly higher than the MSV and ASV. So with this verification of a valid and reliable instrument, confirmatory factor analysis was also used to determine the model fit. The model's quality of fit is determined using fit indices. And this is where we use CFA to help us make sure that the model that we derive from the EFA process actually does fit the data. There's a series of goodness of fit indexes that we use, and we use the structural equation model in this analysis to determine whether or not or to also examine the values resulting from this model. The benefit of using multiple fit indices is that each one measures a distinct component of model fit, and when combined can provide an accurate measure of overall model fit. In this study, I used the absolute fit indices normed, chi-squared, root mean square error of approximation, standardized root mean square residual, and then I use one relative fit indices, which is comparative fit index. And as you can see by looking at the good fitting values on the chart, each of the fit indices was satisfied, and they resulted with resulting values that were in the acceptable fit range. The final findings lend support to support the 17-item 4-factor scales goodness of fit. Again, I was able to find reliability and validity with this scale and this model. And this slide displays the path diagram, which provides a convenient way to portray or visualize the structural equation model. The factor correlation and factor loading and error variance were also within the acceptable ranges, which are displayed here on the fit model. So once I had a statistically valid and reliable instrument with a good model fit, I conducted several analyses. Research question 3 was concerned with whether practitioners or the people who responded to the survey responded differently to items based on demographic differences. And several analyses were performed comparing the sum scores of the 4 PVCA factors, which is again, evaluation, responsibility, community, and outcomes among different demographic groups. And examining those sum scores offered some really interesting insights. Out of a possible 102 points available on the PVCA, on average, women scored higher than men. Hispanic or Latino respondents averaged the highest PVCA score, while those who identified as multiracial scored the lowest. And it's notable to mention here that ethnicity was the only place that I found statistically significant differences between the groups. Those with longer tenure tended to score higher than those with less tenure. And those who hold an executive director position or president or CEO level position scored almost identically to community volunteers and community stakeholders, which I found interesting, that basically, regardless of whether you're at the very top of the hierarchy or if you're a volunteer serving in your free time, you can still create public value at the same level and at the same rate. Also, I looked at how the different sectors scored, and as we can see, education and foundation organizations scored at the highest, and nonprofit sector organizations scored slightly higher than those in government, in the government sector. Next, I wanted to understand how the perceptions and behaviors of the respondents contributed to outcomes of collaboration. So I conducted a correlation analysis to determine the relationship between those variables. And it did show, the correlation analysis did show, found strong relationship between the factors, indicating that as one factor increased, other factors also increased. So for example, as responsible practices increased, positive evaluative practices also increased. Regression analysis was conducted as well and shows that factors could predict outcomes. The result of a multiple linear regression model was significant, indicating approximately 43% of the variance in outcomes is explained by evaluation, responsibility, and community collectively. However, when regressed together, responsibility was the only factor that significantly predicted outcomes. So that observation prompted some further looking to see if responsibility was a mediating variable. And so I did a mediation analysis, and mediation analysis is largely used to understand the pathways by which particular relationships can occur. And so when I conducted the analysis, it showed that responsibility was in fact a mediator. So in other words, adding responsible practices to other factors such as evaluation will increase the likelihood of positive outcomes to the collaboration. And so the final public value collaboration assessment is best described as having 17 items and 4 factors. Evaluation has 5 items, responsibility has 5 items, community has 4 items, and outcome has 3 items. And while they are separate factors, the correlation analysis that I conducted does show that they have relationship with each other. They are correlated. In other words, when practitioners are engaged in a cross-sector collaboration, they really must be doing all of these factors in order to reach successful outcomes and create public value. Mediation analysis also helped us understand that the relationship between those predictor variables definitely can be mediated by responsible practices. And these variables can be used, these factors can be regressed to predict outcomes. So this slide shows the study results, and it illuminates the interconnectivity of each of the factors, each of the aspects of those factors, and how they are connected and continuous. Again, this instrument is reliable and valid and found good fit. So what does this mean? Here we'll discuss briefly, I'll kind of move quickly because I know I've been going for a while here. We'll discuss what this actually means and how we can use this instrument in practice. The PVCA provides practitioners with simple average scoring. This is a self-assessment, so they don't have to hire an expensive evaluator to come in and do this. They can conduct this themselves. Upon completion of the assessment, practitioners will receive scoring using a crawl, walk, run, fly continuum, assessing the responses to each of the 17 PVCA items. The crawl, walk, run, fly framework is one that has been used in social scientists as a maturity of practice measurement, and it seemed appropriate for this type of an instrument because the goal here is not to condemn or make people feel bad. It's to help you see the areas in which you are weak and areas where you're strong, and then provide some relative feedback for how you can strengthen those areas. My hope is that once continued use of this and continued development, users will be able to receive automated feedback based on each of the areas where they're weak. And in my appendix in my dissertation, I have developed a full line of automated feedback that could be received based on which areas, be it evaluation, responsibility, community, or outcomes, that the user was scored lower, a crawl or walk or run category. And so to be able to illustrate this a little bit further, we'll look at a couple of cases. In the survey that respondents completed, at the very end, there were 2 open-ended questions that asked, did your collaboration achieve successful outcomes? If so, why? And if not, why not? So I was able to use some of that data to qualitatively confirm that the responses did in fact match what the theoretical idea behind evaluation, responsible practices, community voice being heard, and to reach outcomes. I was able to match that qualitative data and align it within the factors. And so we'll look at one case. Respondent number 94, a white female who serves as a project coordinator in the nonprofit sector for a health and human service organization. She served in that capacity for between 5 and 10 years and partnered with 4 other organizations on a human rights project. So overall, her PVCA score was a mid-range score of 67, remembering that it's a possible 102 points. But when you examine the individual factors, it reveals that the project, while it was carried out with responsible practices, so basically the processes and procedures that this collaboration used were very responsible. Most likely it was evaluated on a regular basis, which is evidenced by the fairly high evaluation score of 22. It did not meet outcomes. And so when you look at the community score, it shows there that it's a fairly low score, which essentially means that they were not taking into consideration the voices of the people who they were serving. And if you look at the qualitative piece, which is there at the very bottom, Her response was that we did not reach outcome goals because those that we serve were not included in the goal determination process. And so by looking at this score, we can see, well, one, it tells us that with her scoring, and then she qualitatively backs that up with, we weren't looking at how we were serving the people, listening to their feedback, hearing from them, ensuring that they were being heard. And so part of what the instrument would do is to provide some feedback in looking at what they could have done in order to increase that community score. And so along the left-hand side, some feedback that would have been produced as a result of that lower score in community would have looked at involving community stakeholders in the decision-making process, collecting data to measure the social and behavioral change, giving participants a chance to describe their thoughts about the impact of the project, making changes to improve the impact based on feedback. So this is just a small sample. Again, my dissertation has a full sampling of evaluative feedback that respondents would be able to receive based on areas where they scored lowly. But this is just to give you an example of what I would hope that the use of this tool could be to help practitioners strengthen their collaborations. We'll look at two more cases before we close. Respondent number 55 is a white male who serves as an executive director for a health and human services nonprofit organization. He has between 11 and 20 years of experience and partnered with 5 other organizations on for a health and human service, or for a collaboration focused on poverty. And so here we can see that he scored quite high in most areas. His overall PVCA score was also quite a high score. And I bring this case to bear just to show you, if you look at his qualitative response, we track outcomes in 13 areas, and he gives a few areas that they track. And each of our community's clients have positive results moving along the crisis to thriving spectrum. So essentially what this is indicating is that this collaboration is looking into tracking, which is the evaluation processes. He scored very highly in responsibility. So even though he doesn't mention that the collaboration is using processes and procedures that are legitimate and accountable, the score would indicate that he is. And then also his qualitative response indicates that they are listening to the people. They're tracking their positive outcomes to help them move along this spectrum of crisis to thriving. And so this was just used as an example to show how that data is reflected both in his scoring and in his qualitative feedback. The other goal with the PVCA is that it can be used as a way of sparking dialogue. The goal really is for different stakeholders to be able to take this assessment, sit around the table together. They're going to probably have different scores, but they'll be able to say, well, why did you score that? What did you think about this? And why would your score be here or my score be there? And then have a uniformed decision-making process that they can use from this assessment. Essentially, it's meant to force dialogue between the collaborators, because as we can see in this example, respondent number 94, he's a white male working as a program staffer with between 5 and 10 years of experience in an educational institution. He partnered with over 5 other agencies to deliver a program geared at providing access to educational solutions. And his mid-range PVCA score of 65 is pulled down because of some of the other areas, evaluation, basically kind of lower scores, not bottom, certainly not crawling. And it's in a run category, but obviously the goal is to be able to identify areas where you could strengthen, or maybe areas where there just needs to be more dialogue. And what you can see from his qualitative response, in the areas we didn't reach our goals, a lot of variables played a role. The university or other partners that felt insular or only collaborate at a surface level tend to fall off in their participation. A lot of bureaucracy involved with the institutions winds up grinding process to a halt. And so what I would hope is that taking this assessment and seeing that there's probably a disconnect with the partners coming together, and talking about the work that's being done, they would all probably have the same feeling, or if not, this would give him a voice to be able to say, well, this is why I feel where processes are grinding to a halt. Because certainly you don't want to get to the end of a collaboration and not have reached the goals of the collaboration just because you didn't talk enough, you didn't have enough conversation. And so I'll move on from there to limitations of the study. Certainly all studies have limitations. And while the results were promising, I would consider refinements to the scale would be the next phase. I mean, certainly looking to make sure that the results of the exploratory and confirmatory factor analysis, there were items that were removed either because of large cross loadings or insufficient loadings. And so it would not hurt to circle back through and look at those items again to see if maybe they could be candidates for revision or subsequent inclusion. But as the scale stands, the factors provided in the PVCA can be used for future research to investigate relationships between community collaboration functioning, certainly to reach goals that look at systems change and policy reform, like these really deeply entrenched issues. We could also use the PVCA to do future research that aids in identifying the complicated longitudinal pathways that link cross-sector collaboration to measurable social impact outcomes. Maybe even comparing portions of the PVCA to certain institutional cultures, organizational mission or leadership types, or job satisfaction levels, for example, because that might shed light on the reasons that motivate the collaborative endeavor. Also, the sample that was used to create the PVCA consisted of nonprofit and government agencies. So further research could look at using it on other community groups to see, if the outcomes are similar or the same. Specifically, the corporate sector groups that are engaging in partnerships as part of their social responsibility efforts could use the PVCA to really provide a rationale for them in investments in the community, and a case study analysis that would look at using the PVCA during the process, and even at the end of the process could be very helpful. And then lastly, the scale was tested exclusively. You know what? I'm sorry, you all are looking at my I think I'm giving you my limitations and assumptions because that's what's showing on my screen. Yeah, there's my limitations and assumptions. Sorry about that. I'm going through, sorry about that. Let's go here. There we go. Well, no, this is actually still future research. That's never mind. The scale was tested exclusively in the United States. So future studies are needed. I'm sorry, I'm getting confused because my screens are doing something weird. But the scale was tested exclusively in the United States. So future research could be used to determine whether or not the scale can be used in other cultural contexts. Now, my limitations. Some of the limitations that the scale had, obviously, is that it had a smaller sample size. We definitely would have liked to have seen more than 200 participants. I was trying to get there. I did get there with the initial sample, but then when I cleaned and pulled out the ones that had that didn't have complete data, that took me down to 156. And research suggests that 5 participants for each item would give, would be better for factor analysis. So that would have meant that I needed more than 200 in order to have reached that goal. Also, gaining insight from a suitable sample was very important. It was very important that the folks who took this survey actually have done a collaboration, that they've participated in a cross-sector collaboration so that they can speak on that behalf. And that was, obviously a challenge. Lack of survey access, I think that's a challenge because it was electronic. So you had to have access to be able to take the survey electronically. There was not a paper pencil option. And so then finally, social desirability, which is something that you'll find whenever you're doing a self-administered survey. It's specifically because some of the participants probably did become aware of this survey through funders or nonprofit networks that they're associated with. And so social desirability, which is the tendency for items to provoke responses that are considered satisfactory or that, make them look good instead of the actual true responses. It's a common bias to consider whenever you're developing an instrument. That's just one of those limitations that you kind of have to assume was probably there, and hope that it did not bias the sample too much. In looking at their tenure and looking at, because again, I didn't have very many crawlers. I mean, most of the folks who scored fairly well. Their PVCA score was pretty good. But then if you look at their tenure, many of them, over half the sample had more than a decade of experience. So I kind of felt like that may have played a part in that, but hopefully that didn't result in findings based on organizations saying what they believe they should say rather than what they actually were doing. And so as I close, I wanted to just share a final quote with you from who I consider to be the king of community organizing. This quote actually is what inspired my use of the fly, run, walk, crawl concept in the PVCA's scoring output. The PVCA is meant to be a tool. It's meant to be a tool that can spark conversation, that can help communities grow. Ultimately, the goal for this scale is just to create open dialogue as impact and performance measurement, around impact and performance measurement. And I sincerely believe that inclusive understanding of public problems coupled with collaborative approaches to addressing them can really be a foundation for us reaching a community that we can all be proud of. And I sincerely hope that this is something that practitioners who are involved in big, messy, beautiful collaborations will be able to use to help them see new opportunities. And so with that, I will close. Again, I want to say thank you to my committee, Dr. North, Dr. Bavon, Dr. Graybill, Dr. Hoffman. Thank you all so much for everything through this journey. And from there, I'll turn it over to questions.
Thank you, Sharon. I appreciate that. You're very thorough and really excited to see the presentation of that. I just want to open it up briefly to the community who are here before I ask the committee for their questions. Are there any community people here who want to shoot Sharon a love heart? I mean, a question. Okay.
Great job, Sharon.
Excellent work.
Yes, very thorough.
Very thorough.
Good job.
And I'm impressed by your research and the results of your work. I remember when I was going through it with Dr. Malcolm, and my scores did not get as high. I was so impressed with that you were able to get such high results in those areas. That's really good work. That was strong.
Thank you. Again, I do believe that it has a lot to do with the tenure of the, I reached out to organizations that is their sole focus, is collaborative efforts. And so I think I just happen to have a sampling from people who this is what they do. This is their passion. And so I think I had a good sample. And that's, again, why I want to see future research to use this scale with other samples outside of the one that I had, which is why it was so important to get validity, because with a reliable instrument, we know that, okay, the items are measuring what we say it's measuring, but with a valid instrument, now it becomes generalizable with the population. So we can take this instrument out and we can use it amongst other population groups and still be guaranteed to get valid results. So thank you for that, Shannon. But I do want to use it with folks who aren't quite as well-versed in collaborative efforts as the sample I had.
And with that, I'd like to ask the committee for their response to Sharon's presentation.
I'll go ahead and start.
Thanks, Keith.
First of all, Sharon, I think this was a very well-written and well-researched topic, and I can certainly tell that you have a passion for this particular topic, and that's always important when you embark on such a significant research project. I very much enjoyed reading the dissertation. And I know that you've got some future research regarding the assessment, but what are your future plans? Do you plan to publish your research, or how do you plan to get this assessment into the hands of people who are doing cross-sector collaboration?
Yes, I definitely would like to publish it. That's something that I'm exploring now. The first thing was just like, let me get through the dissertation. Let me get through this. But yes, I want to explore. I've already started looking at some publications that do have an emphasis in this area. Again, I want to make sure that my committee feels it's something that is ready to go, to be published. And so once it is, my hope is that I would like to make this as a free assessment that organizations can use. I've actually started testing it with the grantees that I work with. So that's my job. I work for a foundation, and my title is a community impact analyst. And so that's what I do every day, is work with nonprofit organizations to help them first to be able to understand what their impact is, and then develop metrics around how that'll be monitored and evaluated. So I've actually started using this as a very simple kind of a conversation piece of, okay, are you incorporating these aspects into your program? Are you incorporating this? Are you gathering feedback from those that you serve? And for so many of them, they never thought, they're using Excel sheets to track what they're doing. And so for them to have like an actual tool that they can use is a huge thing. So I think what I might do is try to publish with some usage of the tool and gather some more data, and maybe go that route.
Okay, thank you.
Sharon, I have a few questions if I can ask, but just piggyback off of what Kim said. Yeah, I was very interested in kind of your future plans for the instrument. I see a lot of applications for it in higher ed and service learning, and community partnerships that we do. I think it could be a game changer for service learning partnerships. And so I would love to also use your instrument with some of the partnerships that we do. But okay, so my questions. So you were really emphatic about the instrument including the voices of the people served. And one of the things, something that I was thinking about was whether you think like a future iteration of the instrument could include collecting contact information from a sample of people served, and then, sending a survey, like a different instrument out to them to collect that feedback and somehow use that to inform, those overall scores. Did you think through at all, like what would be some ways to incorporate like those actual voices, knowing that all the partnerships, of course, are very different. All of those collaborations are very different, and the services that they're offering are different. So it would be hard to come up with like standard questions that could be sent.
No, I did think about that. And I think the challenge becomes, of course, privacy, HIPAA regulations and things related to people's privacy. But what you could consider doing, that's why I mentioned a case study analysis being a future research opportunity, because then those individuals who are involved in a program specifically, when they enter the program as part of like an intake process, they can agree to being to agree or disagree to being a part of that research process. So it'd be one of those where if we had a case study that we were going to use this instrument in, and we knew that going into it, that we could have, as they enroll people or as people are a part of that program, they would essentially just give informed consent to be a part of the study. And then you could capture their feedback and insight or things like that on a back end as a part of that process. But I would love that. I think that's important because, yes, incorporating the voices was important, because I feel like so much time, as we saw in one of those cases, the very first case, so many times, especially in the public sector, you're just trying to check a box and make sure you can say, I did the things that I was supposed to do. And it's just about following processes and procedures. And so we lose the opportunity to really hear from the people who we're serving and really find out, is this making a difference in your life? Is it leaving you better off, or is it even causing you harm? And because we do know that that's happened as well. So that's why it was so important to incorporate that into the instrument, was that making sure that practitioners are asking the beneficiaries, how is this program really helping you, or is it? And if not, we need to make changes to it based on that feedback.
Yeah. And I think a case study, you could also do some testing of like the social desirability kind of, aspect of it. And you could find out a little bit more of, okay, well, did this person's response reflect the context that, I'm observing in this case study? So yeah, I think that's a great option as well. Okay, so 2 other questions. When you were talking about, the crawl, walk, run, fly, kind of results that people would receive. I was just thinking about how if I got a bunch of results that were like, you're crawling, that I might think, okay, well, I guess I'm not good at collaboration. Maybe I just shouldn't do these cross-sector partnerships, right? And I really like that you talked about how the feedback would include some tips for improvement in certain areas and some resources. I think that's awesome. But I'm just wondering if you also think about just ways to continue to demonstrate the value of cross-sector collaboration, even if somebody is not scoring really high in it, right? Or they might feel like I'm just not good at this thing. So I'm not quite sure like what I'm asking for here, but just some kind of comparison of the value of cross-sector collaboration versus not, right? So like maybe they didn't score super high in certain areas on this cross-sector collaboration, but the public value, I would assume the public value of something that was done with no collaboration would be far lower, right? And so I wonder if that's maybe also, if there's some future research that could be done, kind of comparing collaborative versus not collaborative, and if you think that this tool could be used at all for that.
That's a really good point, Dr. Grable, and I hadn't considered that, but in my research, I did examine a wide range of other instruments. So I looked at other instruments that specifically did look at public value or collaboration or social impact. None of them incorporated public value through a cross-sector collaboration lens. But there are other public value instruments that exist. So and most of them look at public value as being created as a market-based product. And not so much from a social perspective. And so what could be done is a comparative study with maybe looking at public value without collaboration, as you mentioned, versus the public value created through cross-sector collaboration. And that might be a really interesting way to kind of compare the two and draw that line between the importance of collaborative leadership in getting in addressing social challenges.
Okay, and apologies for taking up so much time. But the other thing about the feedback, when you mentioned that, you wanted to use this tool to force dialogue, I really love that. And I just was thinking about, that dialogue tools and maybe like some dialogue prompts or kind of like a worksheet for here's the dialogue you should have like with these scores, just kind of like instructions for people when using the instrument of like, okay, here's who should take this survey. And then here's how you should have a conversation afterwards and what you should talk about. So I'm sorry, my cats are fighting in the background, but yeah, I was just thinking about some of those dialogue tools. I really loved that. That idea of using.
I just think you and I need to work together and just develop a whole workshop on this and just roll this out to the public. That's what I'm hearing you say you want to do. Yeah, that's how it sounds in my mind.
All right, but great job, Sharon. This is amazing.
Thank you.
Okay, Sharon. So I want to thank you for the good job that you did. This is really, really good. Nice dissertation. Just reading through it, questions that I had when I asked, you addressed them thoroughly, perfectly, And so I do not have any problems with the work that you've done. I think it's very, very good tool that you've developed. I have a colleague who teaches communication and does public collaborations, dialogues a lot. And I'll try to hook you up with him. I think this is a tool that I can see how he can use it in some of the things that he's working on. And you've already said all nice things about Dr. North, and I can concur with that. I think you've done a great job. I can see his, handiwork behind this. It's just a great tool that you guys have worked on, and I just want to congratulate you for a job well done. So I hope that when you've taken a break from all of this, you will really pursue what you've talked about. That was a question that I had. I want to say, okay, now what happens with PVCA and Sharon? And you've addressed those, but please don't go rest on us. When you do take a break, but yeah, because I think you have a really good instrument here, and I really want to see this grow down the road. So thank you.
Thank you so much.
Yes, Sharon, I just want to echo the congratulations from your other committee. Working with you over these past years, I've been very impressed with both your professional and your student hats that you've constantly rotated.